Hello, this is my review for The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. You'll find my other Hammer Horror reviews in my Hammer Horror playlist. Where else would they be? Now, this was a first time watch for me. I've never seen anything to do with Jekyll and Hyde in any movie ever. My entire life, I have often heard the phrase, oh, he's a Jekyll and Hyde character, or variations. But like I said, I've never seen any actual film with that character or characters in. I did used to presume that they were two separate people. I had a vision in my head of this film being about two very different people working in tandem in a science lab, maybe. So I was quite surprised to realise that no, it's actually one bloke who just has split personality disorder. I almost skipped past this film entirely because it was very, very hard to get hold of. It's not available on any of my streaming platforms to rent, as most Hammer films aren't, sadly. I looked into getting a DVD, but it was like ridiculously expensive, like £25 just for a second-hand DVD that might be letterboxed on my large TV for all I know and not very good. And I was just about to give up when I decided to try YouTube, and lo and behold, you can watch this film for free on YouTube. Now, some films on YouTube, if they've only been there a few hours, then be wary because they might be about to get kicked off. But if they've been there for over a month, as this film has, or the version I watched has, then it's probably safe to say that it's no longer owned by anybody, and YouTube's fairly comfortable about the fact that it's there to be watched, if you see what I mean. So I don't watch a lot of films on YouTube. This one I did. Now, the story is about, like I implied earlier, a scientist who has a bit of a split personality disorder, and this is caused by a drug that he's invented himself. It sort of brings out the dormant parts of your personality that you wouldn't otherwise show. So in this instance, this doctor is a fairly calm guy, but when he takes this drug, it turns him into a bit of a naughty deviant. He can be both murderous and deceitful and just not a very nice guy. I think his long-term goal as a scientist is to possibly create some kind of drug that's the opposite of this, so maybe he can cure criminals or something like that. But we don't get to that point because he's got way too many problems trying to get himself off taking this drug, because he quickly becomes addicted to taking it and becoming a bit of a rascal when the sun goes down. So let's start with the positives and begin with the storyline, which I was getting a bit disinterested with after about 5 minutes because I thought this film was heading towards being a Curse of Frankenstein ripoff. I thought this scientist, Jekyll, who takes this drug to basically become Hyde, I thought he was going to kill loads of beggars at night time and then try and modify the drug, but only actually make it worse, and in the second half of the film kill loads of loved ones, and ultimately end up in a jail cell going, Paul, you must tell them. But actually it ended up nothing like that. This film goes off in some unpredictable directions, actually, and has some very fascinating facets to it. So Jekyll has a wife called Kitty, and she's secretly having an affair with a guy called Paul. And it dawned on me quite quickly, therefore, that Kitty is actually her own Jekyll and Hyde character. Except in her case, she doesn't take any drugs, she just is that way. Now, I thought at first that these two characters, Kitty and Paul, were just, dirty, rotten scoundrels thinking with their groins, but as the film goes on, you realise that they're actually genuinely in love. I mean, they have a few chances in this film to sort of sacrifice each other for gains elsewhere, but they won't take any of those offers. They absolutely refuse to abandon each other, and you sort of wonder to yourself, why don't they just be with each other? I can imagine that back in those days it was much harder to get divorced. Maybe there was a bit of a stigma to it, but it's not as if Jekyll is some big shot character in this film who owns half of London. He's just a local scientist. He's got no real social status. He doesn't go to any functions. He can't be that wealthy. He's an up-and-coming scientist rather than an established one, unless he's just born into wealth. I don't know. But it did occur to me, why doesn't Kitty just go off and be with Paul? Unless it's because Paul has these gambling problems and she's worried that he won't be able to provide for her. I don't know. It's a bit of an odd thing with Paul. He doesn't seem to have a day job. He's just a kind of bad professional gambler who seems to think eventually his luck with the cards will turn, and then he'll be a good provider. I don't know, but it's certainly an interesting factor in this film, the fact that some people already have a Jekyll and Hyde character without the need for drugs, and yet here's Jekyll in his lab going to all this effort to create a drug which will bring out the other half of somebody's personality if you can't do it naturally. It did occur to me that the cure for Kitty's Jekyll and Hydeness is not actually another drug, it's just love. If she was to give in to her inner desires and take the big leap of faith with Paul, then the Hyde part of her character would just automatically disappear. It's the same with Paul, actually. Judging by his demeanour in this film, I'm not sure if he ever actually truly believes that Kitty will ever leave Jekyll for him, but if he was to go into a proper relationship with Kitty, then he would possibly be cured by love, and maybe he would take himself out of this destructible loop of constantly gambling, etc., etc. Maybe he would finally find something decent to do with his life. In the case of Jekyll, I'm not sure if love is also his solution. I think, I mean, there's a point when he wants to reconnect with Kitty, but the boat has long since sailed. She has totally given her heart to Paul, so that's a dead end. And curiously, Jekyll does get a chance to love somebody else in this film, but it's not satisfying for him, and so ultimately it does nothing for him. It's curious that, because certainly in the case of Kitty and Paul, all they really need to fix their issues is just to give in to each other and run away, as they sort of say that they're thinking of doing. I really enjoy the performances of Christopher Lee as Paul, and Dawn Addams, I think her name is, who plays Kitty. I've never seen Dawn Addams. I could have got that name wrong, hopefully not. Never seen her before in anything else, but she's, well, for one thing, she's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, looks-wise, 10 out of 10. But she can act. She's not just a pretty face. She plays this role really, really well. Sadly, she died in real life, I think, at 54, so her career was cut short a bit later down the line. I think she was about 30 when she did this film. Christopher Lee as Paul is just an absolute delight. If you only watch the big kind of franchises in the Hammer world, you know, the Draculas and the Frankensteins, the stuff that runs on for several films, you'll miss out on a lot of these cool little one-off performances by Lee that are like nothing else that he does elsewhere. In this film, he's so fun as this kind of smarmy, upper-class bastard, but at the same time, he's got little subtle moments of goodness in him that make you root for him. I love this performance. It's absolutely great. Jekyll, I'm not so keen on. I'm not saying that it's because the acting is bad. I just don't really like the Jekyll character in this film. He doesn't get off to the best of starts, because right at the beginning of the film, we see him refer to this young girl as a dumb little animal or something like that, and I never really came around to liking the guy, in all honesty. Hyde is a lot of fun. You know, some of the best parts of the film are when Hyde and Paul are just on some kind of random drunken night out together. I could just watch these two on a night out and forget an actual movie. It would be a lot of fun. There's one moment when Oliver Reed turns up. He's got a sort of cameo in this. Well, possibly Oliver Reed wasn't actually a name when this film came out. I know he did The Curse of the Werewolf in 1961. This came out in 1960, so maybe Reed was just in the last stages of sort of paying his dues at this point. I don't know, but anyway, he's got this one scene where he basically gets into an altercation with Hyde and Paul, and he ends up flat on his face on a table being whacked in the head by a wine glass. And call me bad, but I thought to myself, this is actually possibly just a reenactment of many of Oliver Reed's nights out. I'll also say that there's a good use of dancing in this film. There's one scene where we see a snake charmer woman dancing around an actual real snake, which I found quite entertaining for the few seconds that we see it. And then later on, there's a troupe of raunchy dancers performing some kind of number, which again, very cool to watch. You don't usually see this kind of stuff in the more modern horror films, so the film scores a point there. Now, there are some negatives to mention. So firstly, the film doesn't really have an awful lot of horror in it. There comes a point where somebody dies by getting killed by the same snake that snake charmer's dancing around. But it's quite late in the film by this point, and it genuinely, it was the first time in the film where I realised that I was watching a horror film, or remembered that I was watching a horror film, because up until then it's just one long drama, really. A very good drama, but not really the horror film that you kind of think you're going to get when you start the movie. Also, and this is an even bigger negative, when Jekyll becomes Hyde, he has a physical transformation. You know, he becomes a completely different person to look at. Now, given the fact that this is back in the 19th century, I'm guessing it doesn't seem likely that he would come up with a drug that not only can change your personality, but it also gives you this wild, wacky physical transformation. And then after a few hours, your body will go back to how it looked before you took the drug. That is really fanciful science fiction. But I'm not sure how this script could have got rid of that without changing the entire plot, because Paul and Kitty get to know Hyde as Hyde. You know, they don't recognize Jekyll in him at all. So I guess the story needed Jekyll to go through this physical transformation, but it's really out there. It's something I had a problem with when I was watching the film. On the balance of things, however, this is still a decent watch. The good things about this film more or less make up for the stuff that isn't so hot, isn't so convincing. I'd say this is better than the last Hammer standalone that I watched, The Man Who Could Cheat Death. I say standalone, but there's possibly another Jekyll and Hyde film in the Hammer filmography, but there certainly isn't a whole bunch of them like there is for Dracula, for example, or Frankenstein. So let's get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this film today. We have 1, 2, 2.5 bloody axes out of 5. That is my average score, which I think is fair for this one. I will be back soon with another Hammer review. I think my next film in this series is going to be Phantom of the Opera, which will be interesting because I have never ever seen a Phantom of the Opera film or show or anything. It will be a completely new thing for me. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.